Locked away in America's most secure prison lives, a man so dangerous, so unpredictable that even among terrorists, mob bosses, and cartel kings, he stands apart. Inside a tiny concrete cell at ADX Florence, he has spent decades in silence. But his name echoes through the darkest corners of the American prison system. Thomas Silverstein. Who was this man? And how did he become known as the most dangerous prisoner in the United States? Thomas Edward Silverstein's story begins not inside a cell, but in a troubled childhood that set the stage for a lifetime of violence. Born in Long Beach, California in 1952, Silverstein grew up in a fractured home, bouncing between family members and often feeling abandoned. As a young boy, he displayed a deep anger and resentment toward authority, traits that would later define his life behind bars. By his teenage years, Silverstein had already fallen into petty crime, burglary, theft, and drug use. He was first arrested at the age of 14. Instead of school, his education came from the streets. He quickly developed a reputation as a hot-headed kid who couldn't back down from a fight. By the 1970s, Silverstein had graduated from small-time troublemaker to hardened criminal, drifting into the world of armed robbery. In 1971, at just 19 years old, Silverstein was sentenced to 15 years in prison for armed robbery. It was here, inside the California prison system, that he first encountered the Aryan Brotherhood, a violent white supremacist gang. For young Silverstein, prison was less about rehabilitation and more about survival. And to survive, he had to fight. Inside, he discovered that gangs ran everything. The Aryan Brotherhood, the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla family. Each group controlled their racial group's protection, contraband, and survival. Silverstein gravitated toward the Aryan Brotherhood, not only for protection but also because of his own violent tendencies. What began as survival soon transformed into loyalty. By the mid-1970s, Silverstein was a fully initiated member of the Aryan Brotherhood, willing to kill on their command. It wasn't long before his name started appearing in prison incident reports. Stabbings, assaults, intimidation. Silverstein became a soldier for the gang. But he wasn't just violent. He was cunning. He had an ability to plan attacks, manipulate situations, and command respect from other inmates. That combination made him both valuable to the Aryan Brotherhood and a nightmare for prison officials. In 1977, while still serving his armed robbery sentence, Silverstein was accused of murdering an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution in Atlanta. He was convicted and given a life sentence, which meant he would never walk free again. But prison didn't tame him. Instead, it gave him more time, more influence, and more chances to earn his reputation as the deadliest inmate in America. By 1980, Silverstein had already been transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, the most secure prison at the time, long before ADX Florence was built. Marion was notorious, housing the most dangerous and disruptive inmates in the country. Here, Silverstein's reputation grew even darker. He orchestrated hits on rival gang members, tightened his grip inside the Aryan Brotherhood, and became the face of fear inside the prison walls. But it was one single act, one killing, that would change everything. On October 22, 1983, Silverstein brutally murdered Correctional Officer Merle Clutts inside Marion. Armed with a homemade shank, Silverstein stabbed Clutts repeatedly, claiming that the guard had targeted him unfairly. The killing shocked the nation. It was one of the rare times an officer was murdered inside a federal prison, and it sent shockwaves through the Bureau of Prisons. Prison officials immediately labeled Thomas Silverstein as the most dangerous prisoner in the United States. In the aftermath of the killing, Marion went into permanent lockdown. Inmates were confined to their cells 23 hours a day, conditions that would later inspire the creation of ADX Florence itself. From that day forward, Silverstein was no longer just another violent inmate. He became the embodiment of the dangers lurking inside America's prisons. A man so uncontrollable that the system had to reinvent itself just to contain him. Life in permanent isolation. The Marion years. After the murder of Officer Merle Clutts in 1983, Thomas Silverstein's life behind bars changed forever. He was no longer just another inmate in a maximum security prison. He was now the single most feared and despised prisoner in the entire federal system. The Bureau of Prisons responded with unprecedented measures, determined never again to allow him the opportunity to kill. Silverstein was placed in what prison officials described as a no human contact order. This wasn't just solitary confinement, it was an extreme experiment in isolation. He was locked away alone, 23 hours a day, in a specially designed cell. Even during his 1 hour of recreation, he was alone, placed in a cage or concrete pen where no other inmate or guard could approach him directly. His cell at Marion became a tomb of concrete and steel. The narrow slit window showed nothing but the sky, denying him any connection to the world outside. Meals were slid through a slot in the door. Communication was reduced to a few words exchanged with guards through thick steel barriers. For years at a time, Silverstein's only interactions were with correctional officers who despised him for what he had done. It wasn't just punishment. It was containment. Officials believed Silverstein was too dangerous to ever be around staff or inmates again. He had killed multiple men in prison, including guards and rival inmates, and had become a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood inside Marion. The murder of Officer Clutts had made him infamous. Now, his very existence became the justification for a harsher, more controlled prison system. Prisoners and advocates later described Silverstein's treatment as a clean version of hell. He lived for decades in almost total sensory deprivation. He could not see other inmates. He could not participate in group activities. Even lawyers and family visits were tightly controlled, taking place through thick glass partitions. Silverstein himself called his isolation a slow death. In letters he wrote to outside supporters, he described his life as a mental and emotional cage. I was buried alive in a concrete tomb. I exist in a world of steel and silence. It's not living. It's merely surviving. For the Bureau of Prisons, this was exactly the point. Silverstein's actions had triggered one of the darkest days in American prison history, and officials were determined never to let it happen again. Marion Penitentiary itself was transformed after the Clutts murder. The prison was locked down permanently, operating under conditions that later became known as Supermax confinement. This meant 23-hour lockdown for nearly every inmate, not just Silverstein. Marion became the prototype for what would later evolve into ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Silverstein, in many ways, became the test case for extreme isolation. He spent decades in what some prison officers quietly admitted was worse than death. While other inmates could at least interact with their peers or guards, Silverstein was sealed away in a world entirely his own. His notoriety grew with every passing year. Journalists called him America's most dangerous prisoner. Prison reform groups described him as the victim of psychological torture. Even former wardens admitted that keeping him alive in such isolation was a moral dilemma. Yet Silverstein endured. For over 30 years he lived this way, 3 decades of silence, monotony, and psychological strain. His case became a symbol of everything debated about the American prison system. How do you punish the unpunishable? Is solitary confinement justice, or is it cruelty? By the time ADX Florence opened in 1994, the prison was tailor-made for men like Thomas Silverstein, a place where walls replaced guards and technology replaced human interaction. Though Silverstein never lived in ADX itself, he remained in a special control unit. His actions and reputation were the blueprint for its creation. ADX was built for men so dangerous, so uncontrollable, that they needed to be erased from society's view. Men exactly like him. In 2019, after nearly 4 decades in solitary, Thomas Silverstein died in prison at the age of 67. His death marked the end of one of the darkest, most violent chapters in US prison history. But his shadow lives on. His name is forever linked to Marion, to ADX Florence, and to the concept of permanent isolation as punishment. He was the living, breathing reason why America built the world's harshest Supermax. Thomas Silverstein never walked free again. For decades he lived and died in a concrete box, buried alive inside America's prison system. To some he was a monster who deserved every second of suffering. To others, he became a symbol of the dangers of solitary confinement. A man turned into a ghost by the very system meant to deliver justice. But one thing is certain: without Silverstein, there would be no ADX Florence. His legacy is etched not in stone, but in steel doors and silent hallways, the mark of the most dangerous prisoner the US ever faced.